Greetings. Welcome to Invocation 2023. The theme of today's convention series is Renaissance in India. And we have Dr. Beloo Mehra, Lopa Mudra, and Torkel to have a conversation about four essays that Sri Aurobindo has written on the subject, the Renaissance in India. And this year's theme of Invocation 2023 is the first dream of Sri Aurobindo, that is United India. So we will put this particular subject, Renaissance in India, in that context and see how the ideas, the thoughts, the words, the actions of Sri Aurobindo can be put in today's context of how can we unite India using his ideas. Dr. Beloo Mehra is a senior academic mentor at AuroBharati, Sri Aurobindo Society. She is the editor of the monthly journal Renaissance and the author of Understanding Contemporary India in the Light of Sri Aurobindo. She has a Ph.D. in education from University of Illinois and a master's in economics from Delhi School of Economics. For 10 years, Dr. Mehra worked as a professor in the US before moving to Pondicherry in 2007 to focus on a study of Sri Aurobindo's works. Lopa Mukherjee is a writer, teacher, and psycho-spiritual workshop facilitator. She teaches Indian culture and Sri Aurobindo's works. Her historical fiction, The Soul of India, was inspired by Sri Aurobindo's first dream. It shows how the three countries are one in a deeper sense and can realize it externally. Her other books include cultural short stories and journeys into the spiritual and occult realms. She was educated in the ashram school in Pondicherry and did her master's in psychology at CIIS San Francisco. Welcome, both of you. And Torkel Dancer from Denmark is a mathematician and economist by education. He has worked in economic and social development in many countries in Asia and Africa. One such large project in Tamil Nadu brought him close to Auroville, and he settled here 12 years ago. He started a design and furniture unit in Auroville, and his main interests are philosophy, spirituality, economic history, and design. Welcome, Torkel. So I would let each of the speaker to give an initial presentation, and from there we will take the conversation. May I start my request to you, Dr. Beloo Mehra, to begin the session.
Namaste. I guess it's still good afternoon. We can call it that way. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for organizing such a beautiful series of conversations and sharing throughout this past 8 to 10 days now. So I'm very happy to be here and joining in conversation with both my co-panelists here. So the Renaissance in India, a series of 4 essays, first published sometime around July, August 1918. Again, as in the last time when I was here talking about the rationalistic critic on Indian culture, these essays were also in response to a book by another author, James Cousins, but this time in support of the book with the same title, Renaissance in India. And so Sri Aurobindo kind of begins in describing what he means by Renaissance in India by speaking about that how Cousins' idea that where is the need for a Renaissance in India, because Indian soul has always been awake, India has always been awake. Why use this term? But Sri Aurobindo says that from an Indian perspective, if we look at the long civilizational history of India, there was a period, just like it happens in all civilizational, march, that there comes a period when the fervent, intellectual, vital, philosophical activity, artistic, aesthetic activity comes to a kind of a halt or decline. And it was in that kind of a downward or declining phase of Indian civilization when the contact with the European civilization happened. And that civilization brought in a very different approach or view to existence and life. Whereas Indian view or Indian approach to life and existence has always started from spirit as the primary reality, this approach was coming from matter as the starting point. So with that highly contradictory, opposite viewpoint happening, and that contact happening while Indian civilization was already going through a phase of decline, somewhat in a sleepy mode or self-preservation mode at the best, it had a major impact. And that, in a way, kind of hastened the decline even further. But that is where the need for rebirth or reawakening, in Sri Aurobindo's explanation, we find that India has to find that which had kept her march of civilization happen in its own way. And he begins with saying that it's the spirituality that is the master key. You know, one of his famous line comes in one of these essays: spirituality is the master key of Indian mind. And then he makes a case that if India has to be reawakened, it is the Indian spirituality that has to be reawakened. But again, spirituality is not something that can ever sort of go away as such, because if that is the truth of the Indian mind, or that is the master key, it just maybe goes behind a veil. But elsewhere, Sri Aurobindo also speaks about how Indian experiments, if you can call it, or Indian approach to the seeking of the spirit has gone through different phases or different emphasis. And Sri Aurobindo somehow loves these three. I think last time I was also talking about. So the first phase in which India or Indian mind was seeking spirit was through the intuitive will, the age of the Vedas and Upanishads. And then, so that's more of the intuitive, you know, something beyond mind. And then comes the second phase, or the second, where there has been more of bringing in the vital and the mental. So the age of dharma and shastra, the age of epics, you know, all the classical age, what we call it, the golden age, the golden classical age. But the same seeking has been behind it all. Then the third part, the third major work was spiritualizing the all of life, which is where the decline began to happen. So Indian experiment in seeking of the spirit came to that halt when this final step had to be taken. And in another essay in the same volume, Sri Aurobindo speaks about that would be the last word of India, when all life will be spiritualized, which is where we also get a sense of the emphasis on integral yoga. All life is yoga. So, so the Indian Renaissance, if it has to start from the seeking of spirit, has to go back to the ancient, the eternal idea of life-affirming seeking of spirit, life-affirming spirituality, which was there from the from the time of the Vedas and Upanishads. But then Sri Aurobindo is also future-oriented. So he speaks about that the work of Indian Renaissance is again threefold. One is recovery of that old knowledge and spiritual experience. He emphasizes the word experience. He does not miss it out. It's not just by reading Vedas and Upanishads and Ramayana and Mahabharata we will recover the knowledge. The living experience of these truths, the recovery of that is the first step in the Indian Renaissance on the level of the spirituality or religion. The second is to use this recovery to bring out new forms in philosophy, art, science, literature, all the intellectual, mental, aesthetic, ethical activity. And the third, again, coming to the level of life, that he uses the word original dealing of all problems of modern humanity in the light of this recovery and the new forms. So the reawakening or the renaissance in India has to, in his view, work on these three levels. Now, in terms of the religion, spirituality, he gives some examples as to, what has been happening in the last, so this was written more than 100 years ago, but 100 years before that, some of the trends or some of the new thoughts or new approaches that came up in the religion, spirituality, he speaks about that. So I'll take a pause here and maybe I'll come back to that afterwards.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you for, you traverse that first chapter in a way that it kind of encapsulates the idea of purpose of Renaissance. And from there he goes what I term as the process of Renaissance, what it takes to have a Renaissance, and what are the key ingredients in a way that makes for a Renaissance. May I invite Torkel to a little bit talk upon that?
Yeah. First, I will say, as a non-Indian, I will not say much about India, because even if I have lived here quite some years and have traveled, I firmly believe that if you're not born in a culture, you will never, ever fully understand it. And I'm not a scholar of Sri Aurobindo, and even if I read him, I will also refrain to comment much about that. This piece of work, which is kind of a political manifest, is easy to understand, so I can maybe talk about that. What I do know a bit about is what brings about development. I have worked with development in many cultures, and I have some understanding what forces drives development, and how a culture actually are able to develop, and how in a larger perspective human development or human evolution actually takes place. Any culture has a lot of conservative forces. It has a lot of progressive forces. And it actually gives a good balance, because any culture can only cope with a certain speed of development. So it takes time to assimilate and understand any new change. Any new change or any new idea, whether it's in art or spirituality or science, are often ascribed to one person, but it's never one person who actually makes the full change. Any idea has to have a number of followers. It has to have a certain critical mass before it's able to actually penetrate and make a change in any culture. It's a kind of collective process. It's not one man's or one woman's work. And for example, in painting, you talk about a school, that unless there's a certain number of like-minded people who goes together, you will not make a change in how you paint. You in science, you talk about a paradigm that even if somebody finds a new way of seeing things, he has to have a certain amount of followers to actually make that change come true. So it is not one man, it's a collective work. So the progressive forces, it some way boils down to human curiosity, that humans are seekers. And but I firmly believe also that one of the main progressive forces is actually youth. That any generation, the younger generation, will always question the previous generation. And that is an enormous, strong force. And normally you see many changes taking place in a 25-year cycle, because that actually the generation cycle that takes place. The conservative forces are many. It's tradition, it's family pattern, for example. In many cultures, you have a huge respect for elderly, which is a positive thing. But in a certain extent, it also means that the youth never ever get the energy to change things, because whenever they get old enough to become the elders, they will just continue what the old elders said. One of the strongest conservative forces are religion. And with the religion, I don't mean spirituality, I mean the institutionalized religion. Because religion, per definition, is very conservative, because it's, especially if we talk about fundamental religions, which some are more fundamental than others, and I come from a Christian religion belief, which can be very, very fundamentalistic. And of course, if something is fundamentalist, there is no room for change, because you cannot even question it. If a script is a script, and you take everything literally from a script, there is no change. It's simply not possible. But so I see that many progresses actually have a quite natural pattern, that it keeps on going in a nice speed. But sometimes this process is actually blocked for a longer term. That can be because of war, famine, colonization, like in India. But it can also be that the church holds it down very, very long time. Other things that can stop is something which is difficult to understand. That's liturgy, that a culture can be lethargic, and that actually will not progress for quite a long time. And I don't think many understand what and why this happens. Another thing that often stops development is complacency. That you feel that you have reached a level, and then there's no reason to do any progress. Aurobindo is a little bit in that. Okay, that was a footnote. So I was asked about what Reformation or Renaissance it is. Renaissance is a French word which means rebirth. It happened, it comes from a term that was put on the development that took place in Europe in the 15th, 16th century. At that period, before that, Europe was extremely empowered. The Black Death, the plague had wiped out 30% of the people. The Catholic Church had held down any development, not only spiritual or religion-wise, but science, art, and everything, to the point that, maybe I'm just saying it because maybe in India you're not known, but the Catholic Church had actually court systems for anybody who had another idea. The Inquisition was extremely, you could be sentenced even to death for hearsay. So it's an extreme process that took place in Europe at that time. And the amount of energy that was held down was enormous, because everybody could not speak. If you, as an example, Leonardo da Vinci, he wrote in a secret language because he was afraid that anybody could read what he was writing. So when that broke down, and there are many reasons why it broke down when the Catholic Church could not hold it anymore, and one of them is actually a religious change. It is actually Martin Luther who actually defies the church and say this, what you are describing as our religion is not true. And he changed it. And it's one man who actually did that. It's one of the main forces that went through. But when the Catholic Church lost its grip, it's like a spring that was held down. It's a tremendous energy that flows out. And it took maybe 200, 300 years to assimilate what came out of that Reformation. And one thing that touched India in the first step was actually, I'm just using an example, is Vasco da Gama that arrives in Calicut. I think he reaches in 1498. It's not, again, one man's idea to travel around Africa to reach India. Of course, you try to find the route to India. It was a, you could say, a totally unfounded optimism from Portugal to find this route. It took 25 years to find this route. You lost nearly 20 ships and 2,000 people. Keep on making expedition further and further away to do that. And why did they do that? Because one of the main things that came out of that Reformation was not all the changes in religion, the science. It took hundreds of years to assimilate all these changes. It was a whole change of, you would maybe call it energy, but it's before that, Europe was extremely pessimistic, and they had all reason to be pessimistic because they were actually living in utter poverty. And they managed to change the whole belief to be what you would today call super optimistic, unfounded, ungrounded optimistic. And I think we had a session on energy, on economy a few days ago, and you mentioned this, that at that time, the 15th century, both China and India was economically more well off and probably better organized and managed than Europe. And it has been studied by many how Europe was able to do what they did. I'm not defending the colonialism or exploring, but you have to admire the energy that drove that. And that's impressive, and it is seen. Somebody describes it as Europe was able to write a story that everybody believed that the future would be better. It is described that India and China at that time felt that they lived in the best of times. There was no reason to develop, so why should you throw yourselves out in anything that was risky? So that's what I see a kind of rebirth also is. It maybe you would say it's driven by vitality, and I will agree that spirituality and art and literature is much more important than vitality. But without vitality, I don't think it can survive.
First off, to begin with, I think you can't kind of escape saying that you are not an Indian. You are married to an Indian culture. So that being said, thanks for touching upon this, European journey of rebirth also. And he alludes to this, and I would like to read his words here. The process that has led up to the Renaissance may be analyzed historically and logically into three steps. And the way we responded to the Renaissance that we know, the Western Renaissance. The first was the reception of the European contact, a reconsideration and outright denial of the very principles of the old culture, wherein everyone embraced that as if that's the only way. And the second was a reaction which is kind of contrary, sometimes with a total denial of what Europe offered and a strict stressing of the national past, which is total denial. And then the third, he says 100 years ago, now only begun and far from complete, is a process of new creation, which is embracing the West with the East, and to see what can be the new meaning of rebirth. May I now invite you, Lopa?
So, since my two co-panelists have talked about the past, maybe we should just talk about what we can do right now instead of going back. So Sri Aurobindo has a lot of respect for Indian culture, and he has said beautiful things about what really he thinks the Indian culture was. Again, going back to the past. In short, he says that art, literature, everything started from the inside. So at first, it's the artist who's to meditate, connect with the divine from inside, and whatever vision came, that is what he or she represented outside. So it really didn't matter if it didn't correspond to something that really exists. So it doesn't have to be a person who really exists. So it could be a goddess with 10 arms, 16 arms, because that's what his connection to the divine was. So he was true to that image or that intuition. And slowly this idea got watered down. So the artists were not yogis. So imagine how difficult it is to be an artist, to be a writer, to be anyone, in fact, who's producing anything for public consumption. You have to be first a meditator, a yogi, and only when you are ready, you have the right to produce something that will live on. So in fact, this sort of art didn't exist, except a long time later, we found there were these caves literally covered up in trees, forgotten in time and also forgotten by nature. Like it's symbolic that it was covered up in trees and not discovered until an European hunter comes and stumbles upon it and discovers the past of India. I'm talking about the caves in Ajanta and Ellora, Aurangabad, near Aurangabad. So they discovered this and they saw these caves had beautiful paintings. that go back to so many years. That was the oldest painting that lives in India. There surely would have been more. I mean, you can't have Ajanta kind of painting from nowhere. So there would have been a tradition of painting, but it was lost. And it's almost like a gift. This stumbling upon these paintings came as a gift to tell the Indians that you had your own culture and it was a very deep and high culture. Why are you following the new kind of culture that's outside in? Right? Torkil said that, or even Beloo said that matter was in the forefront in the Western culture, and spirit was the master key in the Indian culture. So that message came out from the Ajanta paintings. And what we call the Bengal School of Art is one of the outflowing of the rediscovery of Ajanta. So this is the nephew of Rabindranath Tagore, Abanindranath Tagore. He is a painter and he is trying to discover something genuinely Indian. So he goes back to meditate on what is really his genius or the genius of India. And he travels himself, no, he tells Nandalal Bose, again, one of the greatest of Indian artists, go and see what you find in Ajanta and bring back what you think is genuinely Indian. So whatever they bring back, they produce this new school of art called the Bengal School of Art, which is still very active. Of course, there have been a lot of fusion into that school, but this is one of the first products of Renaissance in India. And during that period, which is also the freedom struggle, we call it the Bengal Renaissance. It's not very popular to call it the Bengal Renaissance, to even call it the Indian Renaissance, because it's spread out of Bengal from Tagore, Abanindranath Tagore. It went all over India, but it didn't really have the kind of impact one would think Renaissance has. Like the European Renaissance lasted for so many centuries, and that just came up and it was like a flower that got covered in snow. So this is the dream of India, is to bring about a new Renaissance. And if this is the bar, it's really high, right? That you have to be an yogi to be an author, to be an artist, to be anything, you have to be a yogi. To be a teacher, you have to be a yogi. So in all four fronts, what the message they are sending is, be a yogi and then decide what you're going to do. So that is the most important thing. Find a connection to the spirit and the spirit will lead you. So it's a very difficult, task, but something that has to be done. And now I'll ask the two of you to perhaps say what you think is happening right now in India in this front of Renaissance, or not happening, or has to happen.
And if I may expand this idea of Renaissance, which, like you said, it was a beautiful spark, perhaps it a little bit spread towards the Bombay circle, with the JJ and blossoming of little bit of JJ, the Mumbai, the progressive, which came about a little bit later. But then what does it Renaissance mean for Indian philosophy, Indian science? He alludes also to the prose of Bankim Chandra Chatterjee and poetry of Tagore, and he's actually hopeful 100 years ago that we are on a path and it will blossom, not just be covered by the snow. No, and then we have this 75 years of independent, 77 years of independent India now. What are we? Like he also says somewhere that we should not be the worn out clothes of the West, that we picking up strands which the West has already left. No, it's funny. And do you think the way, and not just that, there is this polity of India, the social so-called emancipation, not just philosophy, the ethical life. Would you like to throw some light on that? What does it mean, and how do we use this to revive, have a rebirth? And there is also a sense that, do we need a rebirth? No, like, do you think it's all anyway going back, finding the master key that we are? So perhaps we are like the oncoming, the blossoming of Indian economy, and the Indians you are seeing now almost as all leading G20. Perhaps in 20 years, all of them will be Indian leaders only.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's a very important way to proceed further in terms of what now, starting from Bengal school and then what happened with the progressive. I mean, there was a lot of individualistic approach to, very subjective approach to art that came in, which also brought in a lot of weird experimentation at times also, just for, art for the art's sake, which would not necessarily be what art as expression of your inner yoga. But going back to the philosophy part, I'll just speak a little bit about that because, again, if we have to look at the Indian view of what philosophy is, darshan, it's not an abstract, mental, speculative, intellectual, speculative exercise. The true philosophy from an Indian perspective is also has to start from the spirit. It's an intellectual, metaphysical expression of the spiritual realization. That's the darshanas, right? All our darshanas come from that, from the Upanishadic realization, the Vedantic realization. So, as Sri Aurobindo describes in his essay, in those 100-year period that he was looking at, while this is still 100 years ago, so he speaks of three major movements in the field of, or in the realm of religious, spiritual culture. So, which happened as a result of India's contact with the West. One was the Brahmo Samaj, which again was a way to seek a very rational, intellectualized religion. So, but it was to begin with an attempt to restate Vedanta, but with a confluence of or a mixture of the European Unitarianism, humanism, those kinds of things, and some Christian influence, monotheistic influence. But then there is another, another wave of spiritual or religio-spiritual thought that takes over is the Vaishnavism, the Neo-Vaishnavism, which is more of the bhakti, the devotional aspect, which again is very going back to the Indian spiritual approach, the heart center. Then there is Arya Samaj also, which was another restatement of the Veda or bringing the truth of the Veda, more of the Gyan Marg, the knowledge marg. And then we have one important movement of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. That, in Sri Aurobindo's explanation, could be the way of the future, because this was one highly integrative, assimilative approach with a lot of emphasis on dynamic action to connect or to bring the light of spirit into life. So that gives us the key to the future. If that kind of spiritual realization or that kind of spiritual work experience had continued, of course, then we have Sri Aurobindo and the mother, but we'll just leave that aside for a moment. But because that kind of work did not continue in spiritual experience, none of this could actually be, we didn't see new philosophy come in until Sri Aurobindo writes about, the supermind and the supramental future, and where all the past spiritual evolution, all the darshanas, all the spiritual metaphysical truths, where do they take you next, to the next level of consciousness? So Sri Aurobindo speaks about that even in that time, most of the philosophical works that were coming up in India were a restatement of the Shad Darshanas in different ways. In fact, if you look up even now, I did that yesterday just as a curiosity, website of Indian Council of Philosophical Research. All the seminars that they are planning or they had done in the past were to look at Nyaya Vaisheshika or some other school of Indian darshanas. Where is the new philosophy, right? So somewhere that didn't happen because my understanding is because we did not understand the value of seeking the spirit within or the path of yoga. all life is yoga. That's why this truth becomes so important. So Indian Renaissance, you mentioned about the journal. So, I mean, I'm always looking at Indian Renaissance is not the changing of the forms, but the inner work. The inner rebirth has to happen for each one of us first. And as Torquil was saying, it has to be masses, like in terms of people. Yes, one person can show the path. Sri Aurobindo and Mother have laid out the path for us. We have to walk the path to be able to bring out new thought, new literature. Much of the literature that we see today, and I haven't done a very vast research in this, but a lot of it is again either going back to retelling in new forms the old stories from Puranas, Ramayana, Mahabharata. I'm talking of that literature which speaks of itself as a way to get in touch with the Indian spirit, the Indic movement. So either it could be a revival of the old forms or retelling of the old truths in new ways. But where is the new creation? That I think we still have to wait, because we have to walk the path of yoga.
Yeah, throughout his essays, I think he brings back again and again, looking within, the spiritual aspect. So he says the real Indian philosophy can be evolved out of spiritual experience and not out of the critical intellect. He also expands somewhere else. Spirituality is much wider than any particular religion and represents man seeking for the eternal, the divine, the greater self, the source of unity, and its attempt to arrive at some equation, some increasing approximation of values of human life with the external and divine values. Torquil, if I may come to the politics and society and economic aspects, which is your subject matter. I will read a passage of his and see if you can develop on it. Even politics, society, economy may become a framework within which man can seek and grow into his real self and divinity, an increasing embodiment of the divine law of being, and a collective advance towards light, power, peace, unity, harmony, which the race is trying to evolve. This and nothing more, but nothing less, is what we mean by the application of spirituality to life. Seems like a lesson to Aurobindo also, no?
I think any culture is woven together by religion, spirituality, matter, knowledge, and whatsoever. There might be different weight to different things. I think when you say it, I think it's a bit simplified to say that India only comes from a spiritual point of view and Europe only comes from a material point of view. It is probably right today that most of the world are very materially focused. I don't deny that. At the time of the Renaissance, all art and all philosophy in Europe was based in religion. It's only changed later. Said that, when you say about how to integrate change right now, what I said earlier is that there was a continuous process between conservative and progressive forces to make a development. Right now, things seems to be changed radically in the sense that everything is there, everything is allowed. Normally, a development was a reaction to something that was seen as conservative, and new ideas came in and new development took place that got assimilated in waves of development. Right now in the world, the speed of development is enormous. Everything is allowed, any cultural aspect is allowed at the same time. It's extremely difficult to rebel against anything because anything is there. The media, the internet, everything is at the same time. How can you rebel about anything? So how will change come now? I might be the old generation who doubt that this is a good thing, and I think it's actually quite an experiment in humanity to have everything at the same time. Because how will things progress? Where will you take your rebel against, and how will you assimilate new things together? Because assimilation now means that everything is allowed at the same time. Just take an example, when the ism of paintings was there, you had 20 years of Then you did abstract painting. Everybody got into abstract painting. Then to rebel at that, you have to find a new ism. And that created waves of new, very interesting pieces of art. Today, any ism is allowed. You can paint any kind of version you will. It's very difficult to rebel against. And how will you find a new trend? And I'm just curious how this development will continue, and how will India be in that? And I don't know even how Europe will be in that, but that I could pose to you, because it's when Sri Aurobindo wrote this 100 years ago. It's written in 1920. Yeah? So it was for me, it's a kind of strong political manifest, what he hoped India would do whenever the shackles of the English colonialism would be taken off. And that took then 27 years before that actually took place. And now we are 100 years down the line. What is the option of India to make cultural and spiritual changes in a landscape like that, which is vastly different than 1920?
Yes, it is. And if we as Indians or India has to pave a new way for the world, as a fourth gift, he says spiritual gift to the world, no? And he's little bit touches upon these things in the second essay of his. He says India can best develop herself and serve humanity by being herself and not following the law of her own, and by following the law of her own nature, by keeping to her own culture. So somewhere he says nowadays people are wearing half Western and half Indian clothes, no? So how do we find that our own? And it's not just about right now the political India, right? How do we first unite so that that becomes a glimmer of hope? India can, if she will, give a new and decisive turn to the problems over which all mankind is laboring. For the clue to their solution is there in her ancient knowledge. Whether she will rise to the height of her opportunity is the question of her destiny, as of the Renaissance. So it's not merely for the, like you said, art for the sake of art. It's not Renaissance for the sake of Renaissance. So he attaches far more meaning to the rebirth of Indianness. Your thoughts, please.
Yeah, so by Renaissance, not necessarily that you have to produce something new. You can go back and rediscover, and that itself is bringing to in the new context. It'll have its new life in the new context. So to be really practical, right now what I see in India is that we are actually going through another slump. That's what I think. It's not like a Renaissance. It's almost another dark age, because there's very little inner work that's happening, or even people realizing that the inner work is necessary. To say that India is progressing because the GDP is increasing is really a misnomer of progress. This is not what progress is in anyone's standard, and all the more from Indian standard, progress was the inner progress. So everything that's being done in the economic front, and that word enough is never being heard. Each person just runs ahead, gets as much, grabs as much as possible, knowing that the earth has said enough a long time back. There are just limited resources on the earth. So each one cannot live like a king. So those aspirational again, that word aspirational, that itself is not an aspiration. Just to be able to live a first world lifestyle is nothing close to what an aspiration is. If you now go back to the Vedas, the symbol for aspiration was the fire. And they used to sacrifice into the fire. So it's very opposite, the antithesis of going and grabbing more. In fact, it was giving up more and more. That is what was the real yajna, the sacrifice. So what I see is completely different now. You can call me a pessimist, or I don't know, I would like myself to be called a realist. And there are solutions, but I'm trying to bring the solution. So I'm a teacher in the ashram school in Pondicherry. I studied there when I was from kindergarten onwards. Then I went to the West and stayed there in the West for a long time. But I used to teach Indian culture in the West. So in particular, Sanskrit. So here's something like a foundational, like the mother lode. It's just knowing this language that is a mantric language. And there is literature in this language. So all the philosophies were written in this language in the past. The Vedas, the Upanishads, the Gita, everything is written in this one language that is called Deva Bhasha, language of the gods. And right now in India, there is no sponsorship for this language. There is no love for this language. There is no teaching way to make it interesting for the students. Like so many Indians here, have you studied Sanskrit by any chance? I'm just curious. Aurobindo, one little place like this. Okay, Sri Aurobindo Ashram School is trying to make it active. But India is a huge country, 1.4 billion people. A lot of them are youths and so many schools. Hmm. Yes. Yes. Right, right. Right. Yes. Yes, actually, Sanskrit Bharati is that organization. I've been part of that also. So they're very active in the US. So they are active, but if you see the number of people in India, and given the fact that it is the foundational language in India, it's not active enough. Like to teach people how to speak is not teaching them yoga or spirituality. It's two very different things. And that is what is happening on the surface, it's language. And then as soon as you want to tell a student, do you really want to dive deep into the spirituality? Okay, Sanskrit was a tool, but now that you know the tool, you have to use it for your own growth. That part is not happening. There are individuals, Sampath Bhai is trying, so a lot of individuals who are trying, but that critical mass is not happening. There's no government support. That really helps. Government support helps, sponsorship in schools, and training teachers to make it interesting. That the whole layer is missing. So I think that somewhere I feel it's missing, and I don't know, you may have a different perspective.
I have a comment to that because it's also what Sri Aurobindo actually wrote, that his criticism against the European Renaissance, he says it's actually a revival of the Greek interest of the old Greek. And I think there is a bit of a danger in this. I fully understand the interest for the old script and the old culture. But I think Sri Aurobindo also very much stresses it has to be reinterpreted. It has to come into new forms you don't know. A revival of an interest for something old is always beautiful, but only if it's used to be transformed. Because cultural change and cultural development is change. It's not just diving into old scripts.
And just to kind of add to what both of you just shared, I think appreciation or some awareness of even languages like Sanskrit. I studied Sanskrit in school for a few years, and then afterwards took some workshops much later on. So yes, it does open up doors, new doors, and like new insights into, let's say you're reading Isha Upanishad. But then there is also work of someone like Sri Aurobindo, where he has taken the explanation of Isha Upanishad, for example, in English. That's marvelous. And it's not just one commentary after commentary after commentary for that just one Upanishad. So I think while I appreciate and while I think it's important to have appreciation for languages or some basic awareness, since we are talking 1.4 billion people. And also, I think another important point, what we miss is the diversity in India. So the diversity of languages also. Sometimes by reviving literature, not just the spoken aspect, but literature in many of these regional languages, once these regional languages also go through a new birth of their own, because most of the Indian languages find their origin, or at least several, in Sanskrit. So that could be one way of bringing up the revival of Sanskrit also, or the cultural insights, because language, as Sri Aurobindo writes, I think in Human Cycle or Ideal of Human Unity, language holds the truth of the culture and expresses the truths of a culture. So there is significance to revive or to bring or keep on, adding literature in languages. So it cannot be just the old literature, even new literature in Sanskrit, new thought that can be expressed in Sanskrit. So that is very interesting. And another point, I think I want to go back to Lakshay, your earlier question about G20 and, all those things. Sri Aurobindo uses the phrase New India. And it's amazing how that phrase has caught up now in the last 2 years or so, New India, even from the political dispensation. So yes, the challenge for Indian Renaissance is to really have a new India, but always remembering that we are not a new nation. So civilizationally, it's a old, ancient civilization. So how do you bring the truths of the ancient civilization in a new India? That's why the challenge is huge. And one other just point I wanted to mention, Sri Aurobindo makes an interesting comparison with Japan. And he said Japan lived primarily in its temperament and aesthetic sense. So for Japan to go through a kind of a modernization, it was a relatively quicker process. For India, it's going to be a very difficult, cumbersome, and as you said, maybe with the phases of slump, this up and down kind of process, because India lives in spirit. For the Indian Renaissance to really be meaningful, it probably has to go through some ups and downs, severe. So if, as Lopa said, there is a period of down, I mean, that's one way of looking at it. But I also find that maybe sometimes the way, because in the last 77 years, we really went back to what Sri Aurobindo had spoken of 100 years ago, of the first response of India to the Western contact, which was merely or mostly imitative. So our ideas of development, our ideas of prosperity were all influenced by that. 5-year plans and, this and that, only economic. I mean, it was said that these IITs are the temples of modern India. So those thoughts have impacted generations of Indians. So not to deny I come from economics background, so I don't want to deny the value of economic prosperity. It's important, the opulent vitality, and yet that cannot be all of India's vikas. So sabka saath, sabka vikas, antarik vikas is also important. That's where the yoga comes in. So
I read what Sri Aurobindo wrote of Japan was quite an interest also. And it's true what he says, but I see it a little bit different, that Japanese never actually got modernized. They live in two worlds. They live in their old traditional way. They have accepted another world, which is modern. They are not assimilated at all. And I think real change only comes from assimilation, that you change something to your own. So a culture can take new inputs and assimilate into it. They should not take them over. It's not about Europeans coming with new ideas, you take them over. You get inspired by some ideas, you incorporate and assimilate it into the culture. I don't think the Japanese ever did that. They are as traditional behind as they ever were. They have modern cars, modern systems and other things. In the end, they didn't change.
Thank you. The way I see it, perhaps, do you think it's like a pendulum, no? We went to the one side, and it's until and unless we realize the full potential, the way we have, say, the curvature of the last 200 years, we master it and then takes a, I mean, we don't have to go through that, but like she said, we are not a Japan, we are not like not even China, no, we are so diverse. And in fact, he also speaks about it in some form. He says we should not be Europeanizing ourselves. That's the term that he uses. He says, we in India, it will be singular if, while Europe is thus intelligently enlarging herself in the new light, she has been able to seize and admitting the truths of the Spirit and the aim at a divine change in man and his life. We in India are to take up the cast off clothes of European thought and life and straggle along in the old rut of our wheels. So he forecasts that. In fact, what you are saying as a slump is that rut that we are continuing. Always taking up today what she had cast off yesterday. No. We should not allow our cultural independence to be paralyzed by the accident that at the moment Europe came upon us. We were in a state of ebb and weakness, such as comes someday upon all civilizations. How do we come out of this? How do we redeem? There are certain clues he gives to us. India can best develop herself and serve humanity by being herself and following the law of her own nature. This does not mean, as some narrowly and blindly suppose, the rejection of everything new that comes to us in the stream of time, or happens to have been first developed or powerfully expressed by the West. So we need not just simply reject it. Such an attitude would be intellectually absurd, physically impossible, and above all, unspiritual, he says. True spirituality rejects no new light, no added means or materials of our human self-development. It means simply to keep our center, our essential way of being, our innate, inborn nature, and assimilate it to it all we receive, and evolve out of it all we do and create. So that's a great kind of hint that he has given us, that it's not about rejecting, but first of all finding our true self, and from there, once we know what that innately means, how do we assimilate everything that comes to us? In that regard, I think I recommend everyone to read this fourth chapter of Renaissance of India. He gives this aims and activities, and he touches upon the aim of philosophy, the aim of art and culture, the aim of politics, society, economy. So I would like to hear, how do we really, what does this Indianness mean? And what do you think from there, how do we become self-confident that it is not about wearing the cast-off clothes of somebody else that we can be self-confident, no? What are your thoughts? Would you like to begin, Lopa? Would you like to take a microphone so that your feedback is also recorded? Can you please come here, please? We are today low on budget.
I was thinking, because we Indians are going towards more materialism, and the spirituality, we are in bracket, who every day, early morning, people go to temple and that, but it's just a formality which has become, and not in truth of our own being. It's just a show, or it's a habit that we are taking, but we are going towards too much of materialism. That's what it is, taking away from the spirituality. So there is this disbalance, I would say.
Yes, your thoughts.
Yeah, what Devasmitadi said about externalizing too much and just sticking there. And it feels like you've done a check mark. Okay, we've prayed to Lord, and Lord will be happy. And go to the temple to ask things and not to know. Like in the Gita, he says, no, there are 4 kinds of devotees who come to me. The best is the person who wants to know. The worst is one who's just asking things from God. So we're stuck there. And it's not good enough. So what I find the trend is, what is easy is what we choose. So to study the scriptures, to study a language, go back to working within, not just studying, to actually experience it and go through the pains that the yogi went through is not easy. It's only for the adventurers, the brave hearts. And this is something that is very contrary to what we live in the outer world now. It's very easy now. Everything is remote controlled, a click away, a phone call away. You don't have to go to a person, make a connection. So the ease that the external life has given us is in contradiction to what we are asking us to do, to go back to our asking the question, who are we? Right? Swabhava. What is India's Swabhava? So this contradiction is something that we have to work out, each of us, and not do the easy thing. So even in going back, there's always an easy way out. That who cares? It's okay. We'll be born again. That's one of the Indian reincarnation, right? We just be born. Okay, this life we just wild away sometime. But if you're really going to be serious about your soul, you sit quietly with it and you ask it very honestly, almost brutally, that I, as the external being, am I cheating on you? Like you came here for a purpose. I'm sure it was a very deep purpose. You took birth in this country. I'm talking about Indians who should ask this question, since we are talking about Renaissance in India. You should ask this question, that there's a reason why you took birth as an Indian. What have you come here for? Like, are we here for chasing externalities of life, or just doing our due diligence, going to the temples, putting some money in some offering box? This is not going to work out. So that hard part is left to be done. And the other thing I wanted to say, that as we say about Indian Renaissance, we get too stuck in this contour, the land that we call India. At some point, I almost questioned, why am I an Indian? At this point, we are all humanity. The planet is in a crisis because of us humans. So we should rather think of Renaissance in humanity than just Renaissance in India and make India great again. No, we want to make humans humane again rather than great. I mean, I think that's where we finally want to go. Sri Aurobindo's context, yes, there was nothing like India because we were British India. It was very relevant to have an Indian Renaissance, but right now the whole world seems to be in need of that, sitting quietly with your soul and trying to discover what is it to be humane, and why are we doing what we are doing. There's so much violence that we are just throwing out in this consciousness.
Yeah, what does it mean to be Indian in this global village now? And yet, even in Auroville, Mother asked us to create this international zone where every culture of nation is represented. We need to be united, yet we need to have that unique identity preserved. It's not about being uniform also. So that's where the real challenge is, no? That how do we unite and yet not become exclusive?
So tomorrow we are having a seminar at Aurobindo Society, this very theme, Indianness in 21st century. So you all are invited. So we can explore that question. What does it mean to be Indian? But I think just going back to your earlier question or comment rather in response to that, the mother was once asked, what is the one key problem we have in India? And she said, India has to find its soul. And then the follow-up question was, how do we do that? How do we find India's soul? And mother said, find your psychic being, which is the projection of the soul, the inner divinity within, individualized, very unique, each one going through that individualized process to find the truth within, truth of the self. Because once we are in touch with that, we can be in touch with the universality, the universal self, which is where the truth of the India is. It's not confined to geography or even cultural or civilizational identity. So once I had asked this question to someone about, is it possible to have another Auroville anywhere else in the world? And he said, no. And he said, I mean, it took me years to understand the depth of the answer, but in a way that is true. Experiments, similar things can be done because there is something in the truth of India which takes you beyond the culture, beyond the identity. So what does it mean, for example, as you know, picking up on what Lopa said, developing that self-confidence will not come from a sense of chauvinistic pride on my regional identity, my national or my cultural identity, but something more with regard to the identity. And again, I think if we go back to, for example, Bhagavad Gita, chapter 16, the classification Shri Krishna gives of Devik and Asuric Prakriti. Right there is a model of identity or personality development. To work on a model of human development, human personality development, identity building, self-confidence, why not use that as an example? That would be a very unique, original dealing of the problem that we have of human development. But I also want to just give two practical examples because we are not individuals living in isolation. There is a collective. There is a, Vyashti and Samashti. So there is a Brahman manifestation in collective life also. So the truth of the collective. I just want to give a couple of examples that I recently witnessed in the last few years during my travel. And one was just a few months back. I was in Varanasi and I had heard about this program a few years back, but I had not visited their foundation. There is a particular foundation called Sankat Mochan Foundation. And they have been doing exceptional work in cleaning of Ganga. And they don't call it River Ganga. It is Ma Ganga for them. For every Banaras resident, it is Mother Ganga, Gange Ma. And the person who started this NGO, started this foundation, was the head Mahant, the head priest of Sankat Mochan temple. This is the temple located at the place where Tulsidas ji had written Hanuman Chalisa. Very beautiful space. I mean, no cell phones allowed. So the emphasis is to keep your outer life out. And you have to walk quite a bit to get to the temple. Great, experience there because spiritual realization happened in that space. So that energy is there. So this head Mahant, I'm talking in 80s, realizing that. By the way, he was also a physicist or a material scientist, a professor, Ph.D. at Banaras Hindu University. So bringing all his scientific understanding of material sciences or whatever, and being a devotee of Lord Hanuman, bringing all his bhakti in, starts this Sankat Mochan Foundation. Much, much, much before Government of India wakes up on cleaning of Ganga. So going back to what Sri Aurobindo says, all great movements in India start from the inspiration of the high religion or the true religion or the spiritual movement. This is a good example. Now his son, by the way, who is the head Mahant in the same Sankat Mochan temple, and he's also a scientist. And they have a whole group of scientists, activists, local people, artists, even like ordinary devotees. And they actually also check what the government of India is doing there in Namami Gange project. They check whether what the government is saying, that statistic is correct or not. They have their own way of checking the quality of the water. So this is one example of how not everything is in slum, things are looking up also. Another example was, I think a couple of years ago, I was in Odisha, outside the famous Jagannath temple in Puri. And this happened to be a Sunday. So after our darshan, we were just standing outside and all of a sudden there were these, like carpets being laid out and children started coming up dressed up in all kinds of dance costume and everything. So we asked someone, what's going on? So he said, this is an initiative taken by the temple in the last few years. Every Sunday, different school children from nearby area, schools will come and do some sort of cultural performance. Sometimes it is yoga, asana practice, sometimes this dance, that dance, poetry recital, different cultural expressions, but to bring community together. And to me, it was like going back to the past, but in a new way. Temples in India were always not just about going into a temple, do your prayer and coming back. They were a place of bringing community together, societies together. All our famous big temples used to have Nritya Mandapas. So Jagannath Puri temple does not have a Nritya Mandapa functioning today, but they've taken the pavement outside and made it at a place as a, place for children to practice this. And just nearby, there was a huge, kolam kind of competition things going on to just encourage people. I particularly remember this two women who were making an om only with diyas. So you see, again, new forms of bringing some truth of the old. So in collective life also, I think some interesting things are happening. So I don't want to say about pessimism or optimism, but as a realist, I also would like to say that there is hope.
We have two realists on our panel. Let me come to Torkel, and then I will open up for some questions too. What do you think Auroville's role is in this larger scheme of things, even though it's a small speck geographically? But then what she was referring to, the old in a new form, in a forward-looking, a futuristic. The temple of Auroville is not temple like Matrimandir. The life in Auroville is not the usual life, like the economy is not the usual economy. So is there a lesson for Renaissance in India in Auroville?
Wow, you like big questions, huh? First of all, refer a little what you said. I agree that many problems of this world is now only can be seen on a human or humanity scale. But I think you should be a little bit careful, because humanity still only consists of the sum of all the cultures. There's nothing called humanity as such. Each culture has to do their own renaissance, and each culture's renaissance is equally important for the renaissance of humanity. So nobody can jump away from their responsibility. I think each culture holds a piece of the solution of the future. We have a very old European fairy tale which says as a treasure box with 7 keys, and the keys are spread all over the world, and only if you are able to find all the keys at the same time you're able to open the box. And I think it carries a lot of beautiful wisdom. So I think we all have to carry our work, and I think we all carry a part of the key, and we are maybe all a bit out of balance. I fully agree that West is very materialistic focused, and that's an unbalance. Maybe, I will not say anything deeply, but maybe India is also unbalanced and have to learn a balance from that. So I think we share a responsibility, all of us, to do our work. And the small question about Auroville is a little bit difficult, because Auroville is having its own renaissance work to go on right now, which is quite challenging also. And I think that has to be accomplished before we can find our new road.
If you have some questions, I would request you to please come here.
We had a session 2-3 days ago about economy, and I will very, very shortly from there that even I'm an economist, I will be the first to say that economy has to find a way to step down. That economy has been the ruler of many developments in the last 200 years. And maybe it has been needed, because some kind of prosperity was needed. But for sure, economy is nothing but a servant. economy is not a very good master of anything. It can be a perfect servant, but somebody have to put out the goals. And of course, we all know, and I will agree with what you say about India, that art, poetry, literature, spirituality are the real values in life, not consumer products, not economic development in itself. But everything is needed. So economists are always needed, but I phrased Keynes, which is the main guru, you would say, in economy. He says that economists should be like a dentist. It's a person you go to when you have a problem. Only when we reach that stage, I think we have made the renaissance of humanity.
Thank you. Would you like to say, last remarks, something?
I'll just say, so just as an outsider to Auroville, or accept that as a lover of Sri Aurobindo and mother, and kind of, just when we see from outside, despite all the internal problems in Auroville, there is a lot, it gives a lot of hope to rest of the country, that if this can happen in India, new creation can happen in other ways. This may not be that, for a lot of outsiders, Auroville is still a cool place to come and visit. And yet, if you are a lover of Sri Aurobindo's vision for the future, for the new creation, we see a lot of hope in this experiment. And, there's no point to be disappointed or, lose any hope, because true Auroville, as Mother said, is yet to be born. So it's a work in progress. And I think there is a lot of lesson Auroville gives for the Renaissance in India.
She also said it will be made despite us, Aurovillians.
Yes. That's the part we forget. The Renaissance will also happen in spite of us. So we need
Okay, pressure for an answer. I would say I feel Auroville could be a model of what I actually said, that there are other values in life. Can you create a simple, beautiful life where people have a beautiful, rich life without having focus on a lot of materialistic things? And yet that can be a self-sustainable model. Then you have something that could be.
Yes.
We have Jaya.
Yeah, as I was listening to you, it came up very strongly for me that the Renaissance of India is not just something which is sitting inside India and in the people who live here. From Swami Vivekananda and onwards, there has been a tremendously huge impact in the world, not just the West, in the whole world. I mean, I joke and say yoga is more well-known than Coca-Cola today, no? If you want to make it, say it like that. So that impact which is there, and not only the fact of the impact of yoga from not just the superficial exercise thing, which we see a lot, but it comes from Swami Vivekananda and it goes through. So there is very, very strong, very deep cultural, spiritual sense in it. And then we also have all the Indians who have emigrated, we can see as a loss because they go out of India, but actually they are working from inside very, very, very many cultures today. And that is also a thing, because it always, when Mother talks about unity and when she says that unity is there, if you're conscious, you feel it. If you're not conscious, it's still a fact. So I think that when we say that we are realists, we have to not forget that this fact that we can't see necessarily is always there. And the way it has been working, if you talk about finding India and how long time that took, US or not US, America, etc., and we see what has happened since Swami Vivekananda went to the World Religions meeting. No, it's a huge, huge thing which has happened. So that holds us in a, and it comes from here, and it works towards here, and it works. So I felt that is something we should remember, that it is much larger than us. No.
Would you like to respond to that, Lopa? That the Indians have kind of gone to the nooks and corners, and the Renaissance may not come about in the usual way, no? Perhaps there are micro Renaissance happening all over.
Yeah, I think it's a beautiful comment that yes, Indians have gone to so many places, and the particular organization that I mentioned, the Sanskrit Bharati that you also mentioned, it's very active in the US. So they have these camps, and there are study groups where people have they come on call and they study some scriptures, Kalidasa, or something related to Shankaracharya, or various kinds of endeavor, and this is all free of cost. Everyone can join, whatever cultural background you have. They're doing it because they love to study and study with others. So they're doing it for that concept of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. It's not enough just study in your own shell. You know something, do spread it, because you will also be able to cross pollinate, get their ideas, and you will enrich each other. So that sort of thing is happening all over the world. It's very wonderful
Yeah.
observation that Renaissance in India is not just
Yeah.
the responsibility of Indians in India.
Yeah, and
it's a
also it
worldwide
manifests in different ways. For example, India being a swing state in the geopolitical game right now, that the Prime Minister's little phrase, this is not the age of, this is not an era of war, rather than siding with anyone, kind of throws a different kind of light into how we can do polity also. So there are, in a way, perhaps a lot of hope that we may kind of place on the emergence, renaissance in India. And I would like to close with Sri Aurobindo's words. He says, as a final para, India has the key to the knowledge and conscious application of the ideal. What was dark to her before in its application, she can now, with a new light, illumine. What was wrong and dry in her old methods, she can now rectify. The fences which she created to protect the outer growth of the spiritual ideal, and which afterwards became barriers to its own expansion and further application, she can now break down and give her spirit a freer field and an ampler flight. She can, if she will, give a new and decisive turn to the problems over which all mankind is laboring and stumbling. For the clue to their solutions is there in her ancient knowledge. Whether she will rise or not to the height of her opportunity in the Renaissance, which is coming upon her, is the question of her destiny. With these words, gratitude for everyone for coming this evening. And we have tomorrow a session in Sri Aurobindo Society called Indianness, the meaning of Indianness in the 21st century.
We have different sessions.
9:30 to 1:30, and at 3:30 you come back to Aurobindo. Then we have a session called Role of Education in Human Unity. So I invite everyone to be also present tomorrow for the beautiful session. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.